The 1948 Arab-Israeli War is the most formative event in the Israel-Palestine conflict, but I don't think people know that much about it. I mean, if you happen to be an Arab or Israeli, then you're probably very knowledgeable on it, but most of us barely got wind of it in our high school world history class. I think Middle Eastern affairs consisted of just a few pages or so worth of the text, and with no real in-depth analysis, but I can't tell you how many times I've heard a person say that the trouble in the Middle East all started in 1948 when Israel established a Jewish state. So I'm just now getting caught up on this topic by way of a couple of authors, both of whom have names in which I believe are associated with credibility, and the first is a man named Ilan Pappé. Ilan Pappé is an historian, he's a professor, he's a social activist, and he wrote a book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. Now, this book is written almost entirely from the point of view of the Palestinian Arabs in the 1940s, and the goal, not just of the book, but also of his career, is to increase the consciousness, to garner attention, and bring more awareness to the plight of the Palestinian people. The other author guiding me here is a man named Benny Morris. You heard of him. Benny Morris is an historian, he's a professor, he's an Israeli. They're both Israeli. Well, Benny Morris wrote a book called 1948. Look at the size of that thing. Holy Moses. It's a doorstop. Well, this book is written largely from the point of view of the Zionist Jews in Palestine, in part the point of view of the Palestinian Arabs, in part the British military, and to a lesser extent, you get some of the perspective of the international community. Well, what's great about these two books as companion reads is the authors cover much of the same ground, but they part companies on some of the more crucial points on the timeline. So the reader really needs to make some decisions for himself as to how to understand, how to interpret this historical conflict.
I'm not scared of Jews. I don't find Jews to be frightening. Unless you're in Palestine, then they're terrifying. It's very different. Over there, they're like, the Jews are killing us. And here we're like, really? The Jews? We've been slapping them around for years.
Ilan Pappé makes this forceful case that the men considered the heroes of the Jewish War of Independence were actually dirtbags. They were war criminals, usurpers, and they committed some of the worst atrocities, including dozens of massacres, hundreds of murders, but the most infamous of the offenses was the uprooting and the displacement of over 700,000 Arabs. Here's the gist of it. So in the 1940s, the primary military arm of the Jewish community in Palestine was called the Haganah. And it was the Haganah that implemented this campaign of expulsion, which was a violent and a rushed eviction of Arabs from their homes. Jewish soldiers attacked Arab villages with machine guns, grenades, mortars. In fact, there was a certain militia that worked in tandem with the Haganah called the Irgun, and they were known for their bomb-making skills and their terror tactics. The plan was to intimidate the Arabs into fleeing, then demolish their homes so that they don't ever come back. Despicable stuff. And there were hundreds of towns that were subjected to this kind of hooligan behavior. All this movement of people was a depopulating and a repopulating of Palestinian land that was known as the transfer. Now, in my opinion, transfer is a really polite term for driving people out of their homes at gunpoint, but the reason for the transfer was there was a demographic problem with each of the territories that were set out by the 1947 UN partition plan, meaning the ethnic and the religious composition of each of the territories was expected to lead to more violence, more riots, more revolts, as had been seen in the 1920s and 30s. The international community studied it, and these two groups were not going to live well together. Arab Muslim militiamen are unlikely to live in harmony with Marxist secular Jews. I'm going to talk for a little bit longer about the transfer. So it's my understanding that sometimes Arabs were kicked off land that had been purchased fair and square by Jewish immigrants from Palestinian landowners, from Turkish landowners who were perfectly willing to sell to the Jewish community. So evictions in those instances are not surprising to me. Other times, there were Arabs kicked off land that had been officially allocated to the Jewish territory by the UN partition plan. So in those instances, it's also unsurprising to me that some of the Arabs had to move. Now, other times, there were Arab populations who were expelled from land outside the dimensions of the Jewish territory. And that was because there were some of these Meshuggah Zionist commandos out there just confiscating extra more land. So the author deals very cynically with David Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion was the head of Zionist leadership. He was the mastermind of Jewish statehood. And the way that he's characterized in the book is Ben-Gurion wanted an exclusively Jewish country. He wanted to take it by force, but he needed an excuse that the world would believe. And the excuse was Arab violence. And it's true, there were Arab militiamen who were attacking Jewish settlements, shooting up the roads, snipering traffic. There were pogrom-like riots against Jewish people in Jerusalem. Plus, the Zionists were anticipating an invasion by the surrounding Arab countries, so naturally they would have felt a little boxed in by their enemies. But Pape says no, that's not what it was about. It was a pretext for a land grab, and deep down the Zionists knew that they didn't have anything to worry about. They knew they could brush aside any of the Arab armies without much trouble, because even though the Arabs way outnumbered the Jews, the Zionists by far outgunned the Arabs. The Zionists were sponsored by some of the Eastern European communist countries, like Czechoslovakia, and they were getting shipments of heavy weaponry that the Arabs just didn't have access to. So as the argument goes, the Jews never actually feared for their safety. But I don't really like that argument. And the reason I'm not buying it is because I think it's based on mind reading. It's what the author thinks Ben-Gurion thinks, and that really can't be substantiated. There's no way for us to know that. Plus, the Jews didn't have a crystal ball to know for sure that they were not in danger. They didn't know exactly how the war was going to end. So I think it's kind of flimsy, but let me know what you think.
What's your big beef with the Nazis?
What's my big beef?
Yes, it seems like you're always
What's
knocking.
my big beef?
Everything you're always knocking the Nazis. Oh, it's time for Mel Brooks to knock the Nazis, it seems.
Oh, I don't know. I think they're rude.
I guess.
Numerous times in this book, the author refers to a man named Haj Amin al-Husseini. But at no point in the book does the author address that Haj Amin al-Husseini was a virtual Nazi. He had a deep hatred for Jewish people. He wanted Palestine to be Arab-run completely with no pockets of Jewish sovereignty. And he was friendly with Hitler, Adolf Hitler. I kind of think that requires an explanation. And the same goes for Fawzi al-Kawukji. Fawzi al-Kawukji, he's described in the book as the charismatic commander of the ALA. ALA stands for the Arab Liberation Army. Well, he's another one. He spent a lot of time in Berlin, flirting with Nazis. He's responsible for spreading propaganda that was designed to smear Jewish people. I guess I just feel that in a book this detail-oriented, and it is, that it would have addressed the Arab-Nazi connection. I have one more major minor complaint to make here, and I really do hate to get this cranky over such a small a detail, but the author's abundant use of the term indigenous to describe the Palestine Arabs, it's a bit of an irritant for me. There's an implied criticism there that says that the Arabs belong on the land, and the Jewish people, they have no business being there. Well, that's kind of manipulative. It's somewhat inaccurate because Jewish people, even the Ashkenazi, absolutely have an historical connection to the land. They have a metaphysical connection to the land. There's an archaeological connection. Linguistically, they're connected to it. And I'll throw you one better. Even the genetics connect them to the place. I'm sorry. It's just a fact.
And the ancient Hebrews were Canaanites. So Hebrew is a Canaanite language. It is because we have other Canaanite languages like Phoenician that we have like fragments of. Phoenician's a Canaanite language. Hebrew is clearly a Canaanite language. The ancient Israelites are a branch of the Canaanites. So when you read the Bible and you're talking about the Israelites versus the Canaanites, the Israelites themselves were Canaanites. Okay? And so genetically...
And do Ashkenazim come from Canaanites?
They do too as well. They do. So 40% of the ancestry of Ashkenazi is Middle Eastern. Okay?
Okay.
And basically all of that looks like it's ancient Levantine ancestry. That's what I can tell you. Now, we don't have like Jewish samples. I mean, we have like a couple of Philistine era samples and stuff like that, but we don't have like that many Jewish samples from 2,000 years ago in the Roman Empire, right? So we can't like say for sure, oh, like these are from Israel or Palestine of that period, but it's awful suspicious that they're Levantine. You know, they clearly look like people from Syria, Lebanon, or, you know, Israel, like Palestinian Christians or Samaritans, like about 40% of their ancestry. That's the best model we have.